The rain pounded against the old, crumbling windows of the workshop, as though the sky itself was trying to break through. Inside, the dim light of a single flickering lantern cast long, crooked shadows over the cluttered space. Dust hung thick in the air, mixing with the scent of old wood and oil. It was the kind of workshop most people would avoid, narrow, cramped, and filled with strange things that didn't quite belong in the modern world. But for Theo Trelawney, the puppeteer, it was home. Theo's hands moved with a practiced rhythm, carving and shaping the wooden figures that lined the shelves of his workshop. His creations, each one more intricate than the last, were the pride of his career. The finest marionettes anyone had ever seen, with detailed faces that could convey 100 emotions without a single word. He had spent his entire life perfecting his craft, his fingers stained with paint and glue, his mind consumed by the need to make the most lifelike puppets ever made. But now something had gone terribly wrong. He had always prided himself on his skill. The strings of his puppets had always danced with grace, controlled by his skilled fingers, as though they were alive. But recently they seemed to be different. There was a tension in the air, a restless energy. The puppets no longer obeyed his commands as they once had. They twitched. They moved without his guidance. And worst of all, they watched him. Theo pushed the thought out of his mind, refusing to entertain the creeping paranoia that had begun to gnaw at him. He had to focus on his work. He had to finish the latest puppet, a creation unlike any he had ever made before. It was a woman, carved with delicate features, but with eyes that seemed too real, too knowing. The kind of eyes that made you feel as though you were being studied, even when you weren't looking. With a sharp intake of breath, Theo placed the finishing touches on the puppet's face. He stood back, admiring his work. It was perfect, too perfect. The strings would be attached tomorrow, he decided, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction settle in his chest. But as he turned to leave the workshop for the night, a sound froze him in his tracks. A soft creak. It was barely audible, but it was there. A sound that seemed to come from behind him, from the shelf where the other puppets were lined up. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. First, he saw nothing. The puppets sat perfectly still, as they always did, their wooden faces frozen in time. But then, his eyes fell on the newest creation, the woman, and he swore he saw her smile. His breath caught in his throat. He had been working on the puppet for weeks, and he was certain the expression had not been there before. He had carved it so meticulously, with each curve and line designed to evoke a sense of sorrow, not joy. But there it was, just the slightest curl of her painted lips, as if she had come to life, mocking him. Theo's pulse quickened, his palms slick with sweat. He shook his head, trying to force the thought away. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. He had been working long hours, too long perhaps. Maybe the lack of sleep was starting to take its toll. He needed rest. But the puppets, they had a way of unsettling him even on the best of days. The way their glass eyes gleamed in the darkness. The way their limbs seemed to stretch just a little too far when no one was looking. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and turned to leave the workshop for the night. But just as he reached the door, a sudden clattering sound echoed from the far corner of the room. Thud! The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the sound came again. He whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. The shelf, the puppets, one of them, the smallest marionette, a little boy dressed in tattered rags, had fallen from the shelf. It lay on the floor, its tiny wooden limbs splayed out unnaturally. But it wasn't just the fall that made Theo's stomach twist. It was the way the puppet landed. It didn't land with a thud like it should have. No, it crawled across the floor with its wooden fingers, dragging itself toward him with a horrible, jerking motion. Its mouth, twisted into a permanent grimace, seemed to gape wider, as though trying to scream. But no sound came from it. Theo's breath hitched. His feet rooted to the floor as he watched in horror. The puppet's eyes, those lifeless, glass eyes, glittered as it dragged itself forward. And then, just when it was a foot away from him, it froze. The workshop fell silent. Too silent. Theo's mind raced. He had to get out. He had to leave before he could finish the thought. Another sound broke the stillness. This time it was louder, more deliberate. The woman puppet, the one he had finished just moments ago, was twitching. Her wooden head tilted, slowly, impossibly, as if to look directly at him. Theo stumbled backward, his legs weak with fear. His hands trembled, and the lantern flickered as if it too was afraid. He had to do something, anything to make it stop. But all he could do was watch as the puppets began to move. Not in the way they had before under his careful manipulation, but with their own twisted autonomy. The little boy puppet turned its head toward the others, its glass eyes meeting the woman's, and in that moment, Theo realized with a sickening certainty. They were alive. They weren't puppets anymore. He felt a chill race down his spine as one by one, the others began to stir. The strings that had once been his control now seemed to bind him in place, like an invisible noose tightening around his throat. They were waiting. A horrible screeching sound filled the room as the woman puppet jerked violently to her feet. The marionettes on the shelf began to shuffle forward, their movements erratic and unnatural. The room, once filled with only the sound of Theo's work, now echoed with the sound of their rattling wooden limbs and the creaking of twisted joints. Theo's mind raced as he backed toward the door, but his legs felt like lead. The room was spinning, the walls pressing in on him, the very air thick with menace. The strings were closing in. "Stop, please," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. But the puppets didn't stop. They only drew closer, their wooden faces contorted in cruel mockery of human expressions. And the woman, she smiled again. With a violent crash, the door behind him splintered, and Theo was thrown against the cold stone wall. A thick, oppressive darkness engulfed the room. He didn't hear the puppets anymore, only the creak of the strings, and the laughter. The cold, oppressive darkness in Theo's workshop was unlike anything he had ever experienced. For a brief moment he thought he might be dreaming. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But no matter how much he willed his mind to wake up, he couldn't escape the horrifying reality unfolding before him. The puppets, those twisted creations of his own hands, stood frozen in the center of the room. Their glass eyes glinted in the dim light, fixed on him with a terrifying intensity. The woman puppet, the one he had just finished carving, was now the center of the nightmare. Her painted lips were pulled into a grotesque smile. Her glassy eyes locked on his with an almost knowing expression, as though she understood every whispered thought in his mind. Theo's heart thundered in his chest. He had to escape. He had to get out of there, away from the workshop, away from the puppets that seemed to breathe with malice. But every step he tried to take toward the door was hindered by the paralyzing terror that gripped him. It was as if the very walls of the room were closing in, the darkness growing thicker by the second. And then, the silence was broken by a sound, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the walls like a cruel chant. It was unintelligible at first, but it grew clearer with each passing moment. "Come play with us, Theo." The voice was chillingly sweet, but there was something undeniably wrong about it. It wasn't human. The words seemed to crawl into his ears, twisting and turning like serpents, slithering through his thoughts, poisoning his mind. Theo's breath hitched in his throat, his legs trembling as he forced himself to take a step back. His heart was pounding so loudly in his chest that he was sure the puppets could hear it. He tried to scream, to shout for help, but his voice wouldn't come. It was as if the air around him had thickened into a heavy, suffocating blanket, trapping him in this nightmare. The puppets moved. It was slow at first, a jerking motion, like something mechanical struggling to come to life. Then, with a sickening crack of wood and a rattle of strings, they all began to move in unison, their wooden limbs creaking and popping as though they hadn't been used in years. The woman puppet was the first to take a step, her delicate, painted face tilting to the side, her eyes never leaving Theo's. Her movements were unnatural, mechanical, as though she was being controlled by invisible hands. But it wasn't Theo's hands guiding her anymore. No, it was something else. The other puppets followed suit, their movements erratic and uneven, like marionettes in the hands of a twisted puppeteer. The little boy puppet scurried across the floor on all fours, its head snapping to the side with unnatural speed. Its eyes locked onto Theo as though it were hunting him. And then the laughter began. It was soft at first, like a whisper in the shadows. But soon it grew louder, more distorted, until it filled the entire workshop with its maddening sound. The laughter seemed to come from everywhere at once. Inside Theo's head, inside the walls, inside his very soul. "Come play with us, Theo," the words repeated over and over, until they became a chant, a relentless, suffocating force. Theo could feel his pulse racing in his neck, his blood running cold. His instincts screamed at him to run, but the room felt like a trap, a prison made of shadows and strings. Desperately, Theo looked around for anything to use, any escape. His eyes darted across the room, searching for a way out. But all he saw were the puppets, no creations, standing in a circle around him. The light from the lantern cast long, grotesque shadows that seemed to move on their own. The woman puppet stepped forward again, her wooden feet making no sound against the floor, but somehow Theo could hear every step as though it echoed in his ears. She stopped just inches from him, her glass eyes locking onto his with a chilling, unblinking gaze. "You made us," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with an unbearable weight. "You made us real." Theo's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. His hands were shaking as he raised them, instinctively trying to push the puppet away. But as soon as his fingers made contact with the wooden surface of her body, a sharp, burning sensation shot through his hand. Felt like fire. He yanked his hand back in horror, staring at the palm that was now raw and red. The puppet had burned him. "How? We are alive because of you, Theo." The voice was clearer now, as though it came from everywhere at once. Inside his mind, inside the walls, inside the very strings that had once been his control. Theo staggered back, his mind spiraling into chaos. His throat burned with the need to scream, but the words were trapped behind his teeth. The puppets moved closer. The little boy puppet skittered across the floor, its jagged wooden fingers twitching with every step, while the other marionettes, distorted, grotesque versions of human forms, began to circle around him. "We will play forever, Theo," the woman puppet said, her voice eerily calm. "And you will play with us." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Theo's eyes darted around the room, and for the first time, he realized the true horror of his situation. The workshop was no longer just a place of art and craftsmanship. It was a tomb, his tomb. The puppets had come to life, and they were not the innocent creations of his mind. They were monsters. They were alive with their own dark desires. And Theo was trapped. The strings. His mind raced as he remembered the strings. The strings that had once been his control, his power over his creations. Now they felt like chains, wrapping tighter and tighter around his body, pulling him toward the puppets, dragging him into their twisted game. "No," Theo whispered, his voice trembling with terror. He fought against the pull, against the invisible force that seemed to bind him to the floor. But the more he struggled, the stronger the strings became. The woman puppet reached out to him, her wooden hand cold and lifeless, but somehow more alive than anything Theo had ever felt. The other puppets closed in, their movements synchronized, their eyes glowing with hunger. And in that moment, Theo realized with sickening clarity that there was no escaping. The puppets had him, and they weren't going to let him go. With a final, desperate scream, Theo tried to break free, but it was too late. The strings tightened, pulling him toward the center of the circle, drawing him closer to the puppet's twisted embrace. The laughter grew louder, more maddening, until it drowned out everything else. And then, everything went black. Theo awoke to the sound of his own labored breathing, his chest rising and falling in rapid gasps. His head throbbed with a dull, constant ache, and his body felt heavy, as if it had been crushed beneath something immense. Slowly, his blurred vision cleared, and he found himself lying on the cold wooden floor of the workshop, surrounded by the very puppets he had spent his life creating. The woman puppet stood above him, her painted face twisted into an expression of triumph. The others, those twisted marionettes, circled him like vultures, their wooden limbs creaking and snapping as they moved. The little boy puppet, with its jagged, unhinged smile, crouched nearby, its eyes never leaving Theo. His pulse quickened. The pain in his head grew sharper as he pushed himself up, his arms trembling beneath him. He had to move. He had to get out. The strings, they were still there, invisible, but pulling at him like 1,000 threads attached to his skin. It was as though they had sunk deep into his very soul, tightening with every breath he took. With a slow, painful movement, he tried to stand, but the weight of the strings seemed to drag him down. He felt an overwhelming pressure on his chest as though something was sitting on him, suffocating him, preventing him from escaping. The woman puppet stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with an eerie, unnatural light. "You belong to us now, Theo." Her voice was soft, almost gentle, yet there was no mistaking the dark, unrelenting power behind the words. Theo's heart raced as he looked around in desperation. The puppets, those damned creations, were closing in. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on him, as though the very space was becoming more oppressive with every passing second. There was no way out. The door, his only possible escape, was blocked by the cursed marionettes. "Please," Theo whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. "What do you want from me?" The little boy puppet tilted its head to the side, its wooden fingers twitching as it crawled closer, the scraping of its limbs on the floor sending a shiver down Theo's spine. Its mouth gaped open in an eternal scream, but no sound came. It was like the puppet existed in a different, twisted reality, one that had no need for sound. "We want you to stay with us, Theo," the woman puppet continued, her voice dripping with an unnatural sweetness. "You created us. You gave us life. And now we are yours to control." Her words settled into Theo's mind like poison, eating away at his thoughts, leaving behind only a sense of dread. The puppets had been his creations. He had given them form, beauty, and grace. But now they had taken on a life of their own. Theo's mind raced. He remembered the strange feeling he had gotten when he had finished carving the woman puppet. The way her eyes had seemed to follow him, the way her lips had almost smiled. It wasn't just his imagination. It wasn't just sleep deprivation. No, something had happened. Something had gone terribly wrong. He glanced around the workshop again, his eyes desperately searching for something, anything, that might help him escape. His gaze landed on the shelf near the back of the room, where a single marionette, a tall, imposing figure dressed in dark clothes, its face hidden beneath a hood, stood motionless. It was one of his oldest creations, an unfinished project that he had never quite been able to complete. The puppet was different from the others. Its form was larger, more intricate, its strings longer, more elaborate. Its eyes, hidden beneath the hood, were a mystery. And now, Theo couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him. Without thinking, he pushed himself to his feet, the pressure of the strings still tugging at him, but now with a new sense of urgency. He stumbled toward the shelf, his legs weak beneath him. "No," the woman puppet said, her voice sharp and commanding, as she reached out to stop him. But Theo was already moving, his fingers brushing the shelf, his eyes locked onto the looming figure in the corner. He had to reach it. There had to be something in it. A solution, a way to escape. His hand closed around the base of the puppet, and as he lifted it from the shelf, a strange sensation rippled through the air. The strings that had once pulled at him seemed to snap. The weight on his chest lightened, and for a moment he felt free. Theo turned to face the puppets, the woman puppet's twisted smile frozen on her face. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice dripping with malice. Theo gripped the puppet in his hands, his heart racing. "I'm taking control back." The room seemed to hold its breath as he examined the larger puppet. Its body was carved from darker wood, its limbs more refined than any of his other creations. And the strings were longer, connected in ways Theo didn't fully understand, as though they were attached to something else. Theo felt a chill creep up his spine as his hands began to move on their own, pulling at the strings. The puppet's wooden fingers twitched, its body jerking to life. But it was different. This time, the puppet was not moving like the others. It wasn't jerky or forced. It moved with purpose. Theo's pulse quickened. For the first time, it felt like he was in control. But as the puppet moved, so did the others. The little boy puppet began to twitch in place, its glass eyes flicking toward the larger marionette. The woman puppet took a step forward, her mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. The air in the room grew colder, the strings vibrating with an ominous energy. Theo's stomach turned as he realized what he had done. In his desperation to gain control, he had made a dangerous mistake. The strings had always connected the puppets to him, but now he had unwittingly connected them to each other. They were no longer just his creations. They were bound together in ways that he couldn't begin to understand. "You can't control us, Theo," the woman puppet whispered, her voice low and dangerous. "You made us, but we are more than you now." The strings, the puppets, they were alive in a way that he had never intended, and now they were turning on him. Theo's heart raced as he looked around, his hands trembling. The room was suffocating, the darkness closing in around him. The puppets had always been his passion, his life's work, but now they were his nightmare. And no matter how much he tried to pull at the strings, he couldn't break free. The larger puppet, the one he had thought might be his salvation, began to move faster now, its wooden limbs shifting with unnatural speed. The others followed suit, their movements synchronized and ruthless. Theo backed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps. And then, from the darkness, came a voice, a low, guttural sound, echoing in the corners of the room. "You are ours, Theo, and you will never escape." Theo's eyes widened in horror as the puppets closed in, their strings tightening around him, pulling him into the circle. It was too late to escape. The puppets had him, and they were never letting go. Theo's heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the puppets closed in. The darkness in the room seemed to grow thicker, suffocating him with every step they took. The cold, lifeless eyes of the puppets followed him, their mechanical movements creating an eerie symphony of creaking wood and taut strings. They were closing in on him. He stumbled backward, his legs weak beneath him, but he couldn't escape. The larger puppet, the one he had once thought could save him, was now moving with a terrifying purpose. Its wooden hands reached toward him, fingers twitching as though it were feeling its way through the darkness. Its body, once still and lifeless, now moved as if it had a mind of its own. The strings that had been attached to it vibrated with an unnatural energy, like the hum of 1,000 voices whispering in the shadows. Theo's pulse raced as he tried to move, but his body felt paralyzed. The strings, the cursed strings, were tightening around him. It was as though the very air was being sucked from his lungs, the pressure building until it was unbearable. His head spun as the shadows seemed to press in, the faces of his creations twisting into grotesque masks of malice. "You made us, Theo," the woman puppet said, her voice low and honeyed. "And now you will play with us forever." Her words wrapped around his mind, making him dizzy with terror. Theo could feel his sanity slipping away as the world around him twisted and distorted. The walls of the workshop seemed to close in on him, the shadows reaching out with long, cruel fingers. He could hear the whispering of the strings now, each one vibrating with a sickening hum, like an unseen force pulling at the very fabric of reality. "No, no," Theo gasped, his voice barely a whisper. He had to fight. He had to get out. But his body refused to obey. The strings were everywhere, around his arms, his legs, his neck, and worst of all, around his mind. It was as though they had taken root inside his thoughts, digging deep, turning his every movement into an unholy dance. His once beloved creations were now his tormentors, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that he could not satisfy. Desperately, Theo reached for the large puppet again, his fingers trembling as they gripped the strings attached to its back. The puppet's wooden face, obscured by the hood, seemed to watch him with an eerie calmness. But Theo could feel its power, its presence, filling the room like a dark storm, wrapping around him, suffocating him. The woman puppet let out a cruel laugh as she reached out, her wooden fingers trailing over his skin. "You're not in control anymore, Theo," she smiled, her lips curling in a way that should not have been possible for a marionette. "You are ours." Theo's breath hitched in his throat. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but his body wouldn't respond. The strings that had once been his tools were now his chains. He was their puppet now, and no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. Then, as if on cue, the larger puppet jerked to life, its hands moving with a speed and precision that made Theo's stomach turn. Its fingers wrapped around his wrists, pulling him closer to the circle of puppets. Theo tried to resist, but the more he fought, the more the strings seemed to tighten. He could feel them pressing into his skin, biting like thorns, wrapping around his very soul. "You'll never escape, Theo," the woman puppet whispered, her voice a soft caress against his ear. "We are your creation. You can never undo what you've done." The room seemed to spin around him as his mind teetered on the edge of madness. The puppets were everywhere now, their faces twisted with cruel delight, their movements synchronized in a way that defied all logic. They were no longer just his creations, they were his masters, and he was their puppet, bound by invisible strings. Theo closed his eyes, willing himself to wake from this nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. It was happening. And it was getting worse. Suddenly, the large puppet's hands tightened around his wrists, and Theo's head snapped back in shock. The strings had pierced his skin. He could feel them burrowing beneath the surface, crawling up his arms, into his veins. It was like being pulled apart from the inside, as though his very essence was being taken over by the strings. "This is what you wanted, Theo," the woman puppet said, her voice filled with triumph. "You wanted to make us real. Now you'll see what it means to create something alive." Theo's breath caught in his throat as the puppet's hands moved once again, pulling him further into the center of the circle. He could hear the others closing in around him, their wooden limbs creaking with every movement. The air in the room was thick with an oppressive energy, as though the walls themselves were alive, watching, waiting. And then it hit him. The strings. They weren't just attached to the puppets, they were connected to him. He had created them. He had brought them to life. And now they were taking control. His mind raced as the realization dawned on him. He had given them the power. He had made them real. And now they were controlling him. In a desperate, final attempt, Theo reached for the nearest puppet, the tall, imposing figure that had once been his most ambitious project. His hands shook as he gripped the puppet's string, feeling the familiar yet terrifying sensation of the connection. The puppet's eyes flickered beneath its hood. And then the impossible happened. The other puppets froze. The room seemed to go silent for a brief moment, the tension thick and unbearable. Theo's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around in confusion. What was happening? Why had they stopped moving? The woman puppet's expression faltered, her smile wavering for the first time since Theo had come to life. She tilted her head, her wooden face twisting in confusion. What are you doing?" Theo's hand trembled as he held the strings in his grip, the pull of the large puppet's movements fighting against him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Theo felt in control. The strings, once a tool for creating life, were now a lifeline, a tether that could either save him or destroy him. With every ounce of strength he had left, Theo yanked the strings. The tall puppet jerked, its wooden body lurching to life with a horrifying speed. The strings that had once bound him began to snap, one by one, as the puppet moved with a violent force. And then, as if in response, the other puppets began to twitch, their eyes blinking, their bodies jerking in unison. Theo had awakened something, a force, an ancient power that had been locked away in the strings for far too long. And now it was free. But as the puppets struggled to break free, Theo realized one terrible truth. The strings that bound him were not just threads of wood and twine. They were alive. and they weren't going to let him go without a fight. The air was thick with the sound of creaking wood as Theo gripped the strings with all his might, trying to force the large puppet into motion. His chest heaved, his muscles screamed in protest, but he couldn't stop. Not now. He had to regain control. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The eerie stillness of the room pressing in around him, as if the puppets were watching, waiting. The oppressive weight of their gazes bore down on him, but Theo refused to let the fear consume him. He had made them. He had brought them to life. And now he was the one who would wield that power. With a sharp jerk, Theo yanked the string once more. The large puppet's body shuddered violently as if coming to life after years of dormancy. Its limbs moved, albeit jerky at first, but then with more purpose. Theo's heart pounded as the puppet's wooden face remained hidden beneath its hood. He had to act fast. He had to control this. He had to control them. But then, something shifted. A strange hum filled the room. Not from the strings of the puppet in his hands, but from the very air around him. It was low, almost imperceptible at first, but as Theo focused, he could feel it vibrating deep within his chest. The strings of the other puppets began to twitch, as if responding to the vibration. The woman puppet's gaze locked on Theo, and for the first time, there was something resembling fear in her eyes. Theo's grip tightened, but instead of pulling back, he was drawn forward. His hand moved almost of its own accord, guiding the puppet toward the woman marionette. Suddenly, the vibration in the air grew stronger, pulsing through the strings, through his bones. The woman puppet's smile twisted into something even more sinister. She wasn't afraid. She was angry. "You think you can control us?" Her voice was sharp, like a knife being dragged across glass. "You think you can play with the strings of fate and not pay the price?" Theo's stomach twisted as a new, unsettling realization began to creep into his mind. He wasn't just dealing with ordinary puppets. These weren't mere creations. These were something else, something alive, not in the same way humans were, but alive in a twisted, otherworldly sense. The strings were not only connected to him, but to an ancient power that had been bound by the very act of creation. Theo's grip loosened for a fraction of a second, and that was all it took. The strings on his wrists tightened, pulling him in multiple directions at once. He gasped as the pressure increased, as if his limbs were being pulled apart. His body was becoming a puppet to his own creations. "You created us, Theo," the woman puppet whispered, her voice now low and almost comforting. "But you did not realize what it would cost." Theo fought against the pull, but it was useless. The strings had taken root deep inside him, and no matter how hard he struggled, he could feel himself losing control. His limbs moved against his will, jerking in unnatural directions, his body becoming a puppet on the strings of his own nightmares. But something deep inside Theo stirred, a primal instinct to survive, to fight back against the force that had ensnared him. He wasn't just going to let this happen. Not after everything he had worked for. "Think, Theo, think." His eyes darted around the workshop, searching for something, anything, that could help him. The puppets, however, had no intention of letting him escape. The boy puppet, its jagged smile still stretched wide, began to crawl toward him, its wooden fingers scraping along the floor with a horrible screech. The others were closing in, their eyes locked on him, unblinking. Theo's vision blurred as his mind raced. He needed to cut the strings. He needed to sever the connection, but how? That's when he noticed the tools on the workbench: scissors, needles, carving knives. The tools of his trade. The tools he had used to shape his creations. With every ounce of willpower left, Theo reached out for the sharpest knife. His fingers fumbled, but he finally grasped the handle, his hands trembling as he raised it toward the nearest string. "You won't get away, Theo." The woman's voice was cold now, the sweetness gone. The air around him grew frigid, the shadows deepening. The larger puppet, still moving with slow, deliberate steps, reached out toward him, its hand grabbing hold of his wrist. Its touch was colder than ice, and Theo could feel the sting of it deep within his skin. But Theo fought back. With a quick, desperate motion, he slashed at the string closest to him. The blade cut through it with a sharp snap, and the puppet's grip loosened. Theo pulled his arm back, wincing in pain as the string ripped from his skin. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The puppets staggered back for just a moment. For the first time, they seemed confused, uncertain. But only for a moment. Theo had no time to savor his small triumph. The room trembled again, and the humming sound grew louder. The shadows around him seemed to shift, coiling tighter, as if the room itself were alive. Theo's heart raced in his chest, his breaths shallow and quick. The puppets began to move again, faster this time. The woman puppet, her movements graceful yet deliberate, reached out, her wooden fingers stretched toward Theo's throat. Theo had to act, and fast. He slashed at another string, this time the one connected to his waist. As the string snapped, Theo was free for a moment. The oppressive weight that had been pulling him in all directions lifted, and for a fleeting instant, he felt as though he had regained control. But the room grew colder. Theo turned to see the larger puppet, the one he had once tried to command, standing still before him. Its eyes, hidden beneath the hood, glowed with a malevolent light. The strings of the other puppets vibrated violently, as if responding to the presence of the giant marionette. Theo's blood ran cold as he realized what had happened. The strings had grown stronger. They were no longer just tethered to him. They had connected to something else, a deeper force, something that had been awakened. And now that force was taking hold of him, binding him in ways he could not understand. "You can't fight us, Theo," the woman puppet said, her voice now a cruel whisper in his ear. "The strings of fate are more powerful than you. More powerful than you can ever imagine." Theo's body jerked as the strings tightened once more, wrapping around him like a web. He tried to resist, but the power of the puppets was overwhelming. His limbs moved without his consent, his body betraying him with every motion. And then, with a sickening pull, the strings tightened around his neck. Theo gasped for air, his vision going black at the edges as the pressure increased. The room spun around him, the faces of the puppets blurring into one terrifying mass. Was this the end? Was this the price he had to pay for his creations? His breath came in ragged gasps as the darkness closed in. His mind fought to stay conscious, to stay alive, but it was fading. And in that darkness, the puppets stood around him, their strings taut, their faces grinning in sinister satisfaction. Theo's world was a blur of darkness and tight pressure. The strings coiled around his throat, choking the life out of him. His lungs burned for air, but each breath came slower, weaker. He clawed at the strings with trembling hands, but they were like iron, unyielding and cruel. His vision faded, the edges of his consciousness slipping away like sand through his fingers. This was it. He had failed. His mind reeled back through the years spent in this workshop, pouring his heart into his creations, watching them come to life. He had thought he was a genius. But now, staring into the abyss of his failure, Theo realized the terrifying truth. He hadn't created life. He had awakened something much darker. The puppets, his so-called creations, were never just art. They were vessels for a malevolent force, and he had unleashed it. "I'm sorry," he thought desperately. Then, just as his vision began to blacken completely, something changed. The strings that had been suffocating him loosened, just a little at first, then a bit more. Theo gasped, his lungs filling with sweet, desperate air. His body convulsed, desperate for life, but the strings pulled tighter again. The shadows in the room pressed against him, as if the very walls were trying to hold him in place. But this time there was something different about the pressure. Something powerful, something alive. Theo's eyes fluttered open. The room was spinning, but through the haze he saw them. The puppets, no longer still, no longer obedient to their strings. They were shifting, their movements jerky and unnatural. The larger puppet, the one he had once created to stand as a silent guardian, now moved as if it were alive in every sense of the word. Its eyes flickered with something more than wooden emptiness. There was anger in them, hatred, And then it spoke. "You've broken the balance, Theo." Theo's throat burned. His body ached as the voice echoed in his head. He tried to move, to fight back, but the strings tightened again. This time, however, they were not his strings. The very threads that had once been a part of his creations, a part of his own soul, now felt as if they were pulling him toward something. Something ancient. "We are not your puppets anymore, Theo." The large puppet's voice was deep and cold, like the sound of bones scraping together. "You thought you were the master, but you are the one bound by the strings now." Theo's head spun, the words sinking into his mind. His breath came in quick, panicked gasps, and his chest tightened with fear. He had created these puppets. He had given them life, but in doing so, he had given them something far more dangerous. Control. But how? How did it happen? The woman puppet stepped forward. Her wooden face twisted into an expression of triumph. Her eyes gleamed as she looked down at him, her thin smile filled with malice. "The curse was never yours to break, Theo." Her voice was a soft whisper, like silk slipping over steel. "You were just the means to awaken it." The puppet master who made the mistake of thinking he could control what should never be controlled. Theo's heart pounded. He could feel it now, the growing presence of something dark and ancient surrounding him. The strings that once held power over his creations were now feeding off of something else. Something much older than Theo's understanding. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. The walls of the workshop felt like they were closing in, the air thick with the feeling of something shifting. The puppets, still silent for now, stood around him like an army, watching, waiting. Then, with a sharp crack, the air split. A low growl, unnatural, deep, and horrifying, echoed through the room, vibrating the very floor beneath Theo's feet. His body shook, but not from fear. The strings that bound him seemed to hum in response to the sound, stretching taut as if reacting to something alive that had just awoken. The large puppet's eyes shifted toward the sound, its wooden head tilting slightly. "The awakening is complete." Theo's stomach lurched as a new figure entered the room. It was tall, towering over the other puppets. Its features were indistinct, its form a twisted silhouette of limbs and faces. Faces that shifted and distorted as if they could never settle. The puppet was a blur of movement, its shape changing as it approached Theo, until it solidified into a grotesque figure. Its body was covered in strange markings, like dark runes etched into the wood. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were hollow, filled with the same endless blackness that filled the room. And it spoke in a voice that chilled Theo's very soul. "You have awakened me." The voice echoed like a whisper from the grave, thick with ancient power. "And now you must pay the price." Theo's breath hitched in his throat. This was no ordinary puppet. It wasn't like anything he had ever crafted. It was as if he had opened a door to something far darker than anything he could have imagined. "What have I done?" The large puppet took a step forward, and Theo could feel the shift in the air, like the very fabric of reality had been torn. The new puppet's presence was overwhelming, filling the workshop with a sense of dread that squeezed at Theo's chest. His heart raced. Sweat dripped down his face, his limbs trembling with fear. Then the large puppet turned its head toward the new figure, lowering its wooden eyes. "Master," it said, its voice filled with respect. "The one who awakened you." The room grew even colder as the new puppet extended a long, thin finger toward Theo. Its movements were smooth, deliberate. The shadows around it seemed to dance in response, swirling like dark smoke. Theo wanted to move, to fight, but the strings held him in place. His limbs no longer belonged to him. They moved like marionettes on their own accord, jerking toward the towering figure. "You are the reason I exist, Theo." The voice was softer now, almost soothing, but Theo could hear the menace beneath it. "But you were never meant to control us. You were never meant to control me." Theo tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but the words died in his throat. He couldn't even summon the strength to cry out. The strings were suffocating him again, pulling him toward the new puppet, and this time, he felt something else. A dark energy running through him, pulling him toward the heart of the darkness. His very soul seemed to be tied to it now. The woman puppet stepped back, her eyes now wide with something resembling fear, but the large puppet stood firm. "What are you going to do to him?" she asked, her voice low. The towering figure did not respond right away. Instead, it raised one of its long arms and made a sweeping gesture. The other puppets flinched, their eyes shifting nervously. "I will let him see what it means to be bound." The new puppet's voice was a whisper, but it carried a weight, a truth that resonated deep within Theo's chest. "I will let him see the truth of the strings. And then, I will leave him to his own madness." The room seemed to warp around Theo as the shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker, and the strings around him tightened, pulling him closer to the heart of it all. His body moved against his will, dragging him toward the center of the room. The new puppet's presence loomed over him like a suffocating weight, the shadows wrapping around him, digging into his skin. Theo could feel his mind slipping, his thoughts fraying at the edges. What had he done? What had he unleashed? And in the darkness, the truth became clear. The strings had never been his to control. Theo could feel the cold creeping into his bones as he was dragged forward by the strings, his body no longer obeying his commands. The force that had once been a silent thread in his creations now roared to life, tightening with each step he took toward the towering figure. The shadows around him seemed to pulse with a life of their own, drawing closer, suffocating him. His chest tightened as the realization sank in. This is not just about control anymore. This is about survival. The puppet, the one that had awakened from the depths of his creation, loomed over him like a dark god, its hollow eyes fixed on Theo. It was as if the room itself had become a living, breathing entity, and Theo, once the master of his craft, was now nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. "You don't understand, do you?" The voice of the towering puppet echoed through his mind, cold and relentless. "You thought you could create life, that you could manipulate the very essence of existence. But you were never the creator, Theo. You were always the vessel." Theo's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to fight the strings, but his movements were sluggish, as if his own body were betraying him. The room twisted around him, the walls bending and stretching, as though the very fabric of reality had been unraveled. The puppets, once silent and obedient, now stood like a dark army around him, their eyes locked onto him with something far darker than mere malice, hatred. "You woke me, Theo." The puppet's voice was low, smooth like silk, yet there was an undercurrent of something ancient, something terrifying in its tone. "And now you will learn the price of creation." Theo wanted to speak, wanted to beg for mercy, but the words caught in his throat. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What had he done? He had always known there was something different about his creations, but he had never expected this. Never expected that he would awaken something so dark, something so powerful. The large puppet stepped forward, its wooden body creaking with each movement. "We are not your creations, Theo." It spoke, its voice tinged with a twisted kind of pity. "We are the manifestation of your desire, your greed. You sought to control life, to play God. And now you must face the consequences." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air, suffocating Theo with their truth. His mind reeled, trying to comprehend what was happening. He had never meant for this to happen. He had never meant to awaken whatever force lay dormant within his puppets. But it was too late now. With a final, deafening crack, the strings that had once held Theo in place loosened. His body slumped forward, disoriented and weak. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his mind reeling from the overwhelming force that had consumed him. The puppets circled around him, their eyes unblinking, their expressions twisted with an expression he could not fully grasp. The woman puppet, once the most beautiful of his creations, now appeared almost grotesque, her smile stretched too wide, her eyes vacant and cold. She stepped forward, tilting her head as if studying him, her wooden fingers brushing lightly against his cheek. "You are not the master anymore, Theo." Her voice was a soft whisper, almost mocking. You are the puppet now. Theo's heart raced, the terror and realization crashing down on him like a wave. He had created these beings, had brought them to life, but now he was their prisoner. The strings that had once been his tools of power now bound him, tightening around him with every breath he took. His muscles screamed for freedom, but there was nothing he could do. The puppets were in control now. Why did you do this? Theo's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, as he struggled to lift his head to face the towering puppet. Why did you let me make you? The puppet's hollow eyes seemed to pierce through him, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something pity before it was gone. The large puppet stepped forward, its body towering over Theo. Because you sought it. It spoke slowly, its voice heavy with ancient wisdom. You sought power, Theo. You thought you could manipulate life itself. But you were just a fool. Theo's body jerked as the strings pulled him back to his feet. His limbs moved against his will, his body nothing more than a puppet in the hands of the very creations he had once controlled. He fought against it, but the force was too strong, too overwhelming. His muscles screamed in protest, but the strings were relentless. And then something snapped. The strings that had been holding Theo in place shattered. For a brief moment he was free. He gasped for air, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But before he could even take a step, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. He looked down and his heart sank. A string had pierced his skin, its sharp end lodged deep within his heart. He could feel the coldness of it, the way it seemed to sink into his very soul. The puppets closed in, their eyes now glowing with a sinister light. The large puppet's gaze never left him, its eyes filled with something that could only be described as a mixture of contempt and pity. You are the puppet now, Theo. The woman puppet's voice was cold, almost cruel. And the strings will never release you. Theo's breath quickened as he felt the pull of the strings deepen. His body moved against his will, jerking toward the center of the room. The shadows closed in around him, thick and suffocating. He could feel them pressing against him, pulling him in, dragging him deeper into their grasp. The towering puppet took one final step forward, its wooden hand reaching out to touch Theo's face. The coldness of its fingers sent a jolt of terror through him, but he couldn't move. He couldn't escape. You sought to control us, Theo. The puppet's voice was almost tender now, but there was no warmth in it. But now you will learn what it truly means to be controlled. Theo's heart pounded in his chest as the last of his resistance melted away. He could feel the darkness closing in, the weight of the curse he had unknowingly unleashed pressing down on him like a vice. The strings had taken root, and there was no escaping them. There is no escaping the curse of creation. And with that thought, Theo's vision blurred, the world around him fading into darkness. His body jerked one last time as the strings tightened around him, pulling him deeper into the heart of the curse. Theo's world was a suffocating darkness, his mind spinning in a fog of fear and confusion. The strings that had once been his tools of creation, his only source of power, now twisted around his body like chains, dragging him deeper into the heart of the nightmare he had unleashed. His chest ached with each labored breath, his every movement restrained by the cold, unyielding cords. His limbs jerked uncontrollably, as though his very soul was being pulled in 1,000 different directions. The room, once his sanctuary, had become a prison, a dark, twisted reflection of the chaos he had brought into being. The puppets, those lifeless figures he had crafted with such care and precision, now stood as sentinels, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. They circled him like vultures, their faces expressionless, their movements stiff and deliberate. He could feel their gaze on him, cold and unforgiving, as if they were waiting for something. And then, the towering puppet, the one who had brought the curse to life, stepped forward. Its wooden face was a mask of solemn authority, its eyes deep and endless, as though they could peer into the very core of his being. It raised a hand, and the shadows seemed to part in response, as though the darkness itself bowed to its will. You thought you could control us, Theo, the puppet's voice rumbled, deep and resonant. You thought you could shape us, But you were always the one who was being shaped. Theo's heart thudded painfully in his chest. The puppet's words cut deeper than any blade. This was his fault. He had brought this upon himself, upon them. His mind raced, but there was no escape, no way out. The strings that bound him were too tight, too strong. They had taken root inside him, wrapped around his very soul, and now he was nothing but a puppet in the hands of something far older, far more powerful than he could ever comprehend. You are nothing but a vessel, Theo, the large puppet continued, its voice like thunder, a tool for our awakening. And now you will learn the true cost of your arrogance. Theo's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, to plead for mercy, but his words were choked by the suffocating grip of the strings. His body trembled violently, his limbs jerking as the curse took hold of him with an iron grip. He could feel the cold energy seeping into his bones, his very essence being twisted, contorted by the force of the dark power he had unwittingly freed. The woman puppet, her wooden face contorted into a twisted smile, stepped closer. Her eyes glittered with malice, and her voice was a soft whisper that sent chills down his spine. You should have left us where we belonged, Theo. In the darkness, where we could not hurt you. Her fingers brushed his cheek, and the touch was cold. Colder than anything he had ever felt. It was as though the very life was being drained from him with each passing second. The shadows around him thickened, pressing in from all sides, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop, sending a wave of icy terror through his body. Theo could feel his strength fading, his mind slipping into a haze as the curse continued to tighten its grip. He had no control over his body, no control over his thoughts. His soul was being torn apart by the weight of his own creation. But then, in the depths of his fear and despair, something within him stirred. A flicker of defiance, a whisper of the man he once was, rose up against the dark forces that had consumed him. The very thing he had created, the puppets, were now his only hope. He had made them, after all, crafted each one with his own hands, breathed life into them with his own will. They were a part of him, and perhaps, just perhaps, he could use that connection to break free. Think, Theo. Think. His mind raced as the puppets closed in around him. The large puppet, its gaze like fire, was the closest now. The air between them hummed with dark energy, and Theo could feel the heat of its presence against his skin. He knew he couldn't escape this curse by force. It was too strong, too ancient. But maybe there was another way, a way to turn the curse against them. His thoughts, disjointed and frenzied, began to piece together the truth of his situation. He had created these puppets, yes, but he had also embedded a part of himself into them. Every thread, every joint, every piece of wood had been shaped by his hands, his mind. And as much as they had become his captors, they had also become his creations. His connection to them was deeper than the strings that bound him. It was his will that had brought them to life. He focused on that, drawing on the power of his own creation, the bond between them that ran deeper than mere strings. It's not over. Not yet. With every ounce of strength he had left, Theo fought to regain control of his body. His limbs shook violently, but slowly, agonizingly, he began to move. The strings that had been pulling him, bending him to the will of the puppets, began to loosen, inch by inch. His fingers twitched, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt the faintest spark of control. The large puppet, sensing the shift, stepped back. Its eyes widened, its hollow gaze narrowing as it watched him with growing suspicion. "What are you doing?" it asked, its voice rising with the first hint of uncertainty. "You cannot break free. You are ours." But Theo's mind was clear now. The curse, the strings, the puppets, they were nothing without his will. He had been the one to give them life, and it was his will that would shape their fate. With a surge of strength, he reached deep into himself, pulling on that thread of connection that still existed between them. And with that, something snapped. The puppets froze. The large puppet's wooden face twitched, its eyes widening as if it could no longer comprehend what was happening. The woman puppet staggered back, her twisted smile faltering as her movements became jerky, uncertain. Theo's body moved again, but this time it was his own will that guided him. He gritted his teeth against the pain, feeling the strings that had once been his prison now unraveling beneath his control. "No!" the large puppet bellowed, its voice cracking with rage. "You cannot control us. You are nothing." But it was too late. The power had already shifted. The strings, once twisted and bound around Theo's body like chains, now coiled and snapped back toward the puppets. One by one, they were pulled off their feet, their wooden bodies jerking and twisting as the energy that had bound them to Theo's will turned against them. Theo's heart raced as he watched the puppets, his creations, fall to the ground like broken dolls. Their once lifeless eyes flickered with fear as the force they had once controlled turned back on them. And then, the room erupted in chaos. The shadows, the darkness that had been growing, began to recede, pulled back by the force of Theo's will. The room, once a twisted reflection of his nightmares, began to settle, returning to the stillness it had once held. The oppressive weight that had filled the air lifted, and the coldness that had seeped into his bones began to fade. Theo's breath was ragged as he stood alone in the now empty workshop, the remnants of his creations scattered around him. He had broken free. He had survived. But the cost had been far higher than he had ever imagined. He had lost his creations. He had lost his power. And worse still, he had lost himself. The workshop, once his sanctuary, now felt hollow, empty. The echoes of the puppets' laughter, their whispers, still lingered in the air, like a haunting memory of what had been. As Theo looked around, his mind reeling with the aftermath of what had happened, one thought echoed in his mind, a chilling truth that would stay with him forever. The curse was never truly broken. It had only just begun.